A young couple, deeply in love, arrives at a tropical island for their honeymoon. 3 days later, they are gone. They didn't check out. They didn't board their flight home. Their rented Jeep is found parked near a quiet beach, locked, with their money, passports, and all their belongings still inside. It is as if they simply walked into the air and vanished. For 6 years, there's not a single sign of them. No boletos, no ransom notes, no leads. Then, out of the blue, a phone call changes everything. What happened during those 6 missing years is a mystery that defies all explanation. If you want to explore the world's most compelling real-life mysteries with us, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover the facts behind the stories that seem too strange to be true. Now, we'd love to know where our audience is watching from. Comment your city name below. The small, single-engine plane dipped its wing, offering a final, breathtaking view of the island paradise below. From this height, St. Thomas was a postcard come to life, a jewel of green mountains and white sand beaches set in the impossible blue of the Caribbean Sea. In the passenger seats, David and Emily Lawson held hands, their faces pressed to the window. They were young, deeply in love, and at the very beginning of their greatest adventure. It was September 14th, 1975. They were 24 years old. 3 days later, they were gone. The first thread of the mystery began not with a scream, but with a simple, unanswered phone call. David's father, Arthur Lawson, a meticulous man who ran a successful accounting firm in Hartford, Connecticut, had scheduled a weekly check-in. It was a formality, a way for a worried father to hear his son's voice from a faraway place. The phone in their rented villa rang and rang into the humid island evening. Arthur, frowning at the silent receiver, dismissed it. They were young. They were on their honeymoon. They had likely forgotten, lost in their own blissful world. But the next day, the phone still went unanswered. And the next, a low, nagging worry began to curdle in Arthur's stomach. This was not like David. His son was reliable, organized, a planner. He would not forget a call he had personally arranged. Not for 3 days straight. By the 4th day, the worry had solidified into a cold, hard knot of fear. Arthur's calls to the villa's landlord were met with cheerful reassurances. "They are probably out exploring, my friend, enjoying the island. Do not worry." But Arthur did worry. He called the airline. David and Emily had never boarded their scheduled flight home. That was the moment the world shifted. The moment a parent's quiet concern exploded into full-blown, heart-stopping terror. The Lawsons immediately contacted the local police in St. Thomas. The initial investigation was, by all accounts, slow and hampered by the relaxed island pace and the assumption that the young American couple had simply moved on. It was a honeymoon, after all. Perhaps they had decided to extend their stay on a different island without telling anyone. It was unlikely, but it was a more pleasant thought than the alternatives. The local police finally went to the villa. What they found, or more accurately, what they did not find, sent the first true chill through the case. The villa was not a scene of chaos. There was no sign of a struggle. Their suitcases were still there, neatly packed. Their clothes hung in the closet. David's expensive camera sat on the dresser. Emily's wedding ring lay in a small ceramic dish next to the bathroom sink, a detail that would haunt her mother for years. It was as if they had simply stepped out for a walk, for a swim, and had never come back. They had vanished into the balmy Caribbean air, leaving behind everything they owned. The only thing that was missing was their red Jeep CJ5 rental vehicle. The search now had a focal point. Police and volunteers fanned out across the island, checking beaches, cliffs, and jungles. 2 days after the search began, a park ranger made a discovery that deepened the mystery exponentially. The red Jeep was found parked neatly at the end of a dirt road leading to a remote, secluded beach on the North Shore known as Megan's Bay. The vehicle was locked. The keys were gone. Inside, everything was orderly. There was no blood, no sign of violence. A map of the island was folded on the passenger seat. David's wallet, containing $57 in cash and all his identification, was in the glove compartment. Emily's purse, with her own money and ID, was on the floor. They had left everything behind. Theories, of course, began to swirl like the island winds. Had they been attacked? Robbed? But robbers do not leave money behind. Had they been kidnapped? But no ransom note ever arrived. Had they been murdered? But there were no bodies, no witnesses, no evidence of any crime at all. The most popular local theory, one whispered in bars and cafes, was that they had gone for a swim in the deceptively powerful currents of Megan's Bay and drowned. The ocean, they said, does not always give back its victims. It was a tragic, simple explanation, but for the families it did not fit. David was a strong swimmer. Emily was cautious. They would not have both gone into dangerous water. And even if they had, where were their bodies? Their clothes? Their towels? The beach was utterly empty. The official search continued for weeks, then months, scouring the land and sea. It yielded nothing. The case grew cold, a frustrating file in a drawer marked missing persons. The families in Connecticut were left in a special kind of hell, a purgatory of grief without closure, of hope that slowly, agonizingly, turned to dust. Years passed. The world moved on. The disco era faded. A new decade dawned. David and Emily Lawson became a sad, half-remembered story, a cautionary tale about a paradise that could hide a very dark secret. Their photographs, once splashed across newspapers, were stored away in boxes. The world had forgotten. But on a morning in March 1981, nearly 6 years after they disappeared, the story erupted back into the headlines with the force of a lightning strike. The phone rang in the Hartford home of Arthur Lawson. The voice on the other end was a reporter, breathless and urgent, asking for a comment on the incredible news. Arthur, his heart hammering against his ribs, could barely form the words. "What news?" The couple, the reporter said, had been found. They were alive. They were in a small, run-down apartment in a rough neighborhood of Baltimore, Maryland. They had been discovered by a sharp-eyed Social Security administrator who noticed discrepancies in their paperwork, their identities. They were using different names, living a life of startling poverty and obscurity. But it was them, David and Emily Lawson, the honeymooners who vanished from a Caribbean beach, were alive. They had been missing for 2,122 days. The news did not bring relief. It unleashed a storm of questions that were far more terrifying than the silence of the unknown. Where had they been for 6 years? Why had they not called? Why were they hiding? And the most unsettling question of all, the one that would form the core of a mystery that endures to this day. If they had left of their own free will, why did they look like they had spent every second of those 6 years in hell? The news, when it broke, was not a gentle wave of relief, but a seismic shock that fractured the very foundations of the known story. David and Emily Lawson were not dead. They were in Baltimore. The world, which had long since mourned them, now stared in bewildered horror at the grainy, hastily taken photographs that hit the news wires. The images showed a man and a woman, painfully thin, their faces etched with a deep, hollow exhaustion that no 24-year-old should ever possess. They were being led from a dilapidated brick apartment building by plainclothes detectives, their eyes downcast, their clothes hanging off their frames like rags on a scarecrow. They looked like survivors of a famine or a war, not a couple who had chosen to disappear. The discovery was as bizarre as the disappearance itself. It was March 19th, 1981. A sharp, no-nonsense Social Security administrator named Mary Ann Cole had been processing a routine application for benefit from a man named Thomas Brennan. The paperwork was for a disability claim, citing severe malnutrition and psychological trauma. Something about the application fell off. The man's history was sparse, his references thin. A deeper check, a cross-reference with a missing persons database that was more luck than standard procedure, triggered a silent alarm. Thomas Brennan's physical description and date of birth were a near-perfect match for David Lawson, a man who had vanished from the face of the earth 6 years prior. The woman listed as his wife on the application, Clara Brennan, matched Emily Lawson. Cole did not call the couple. She called the police. Baltimore PD, skeptical but thorough, dispatched 2 detectives to the address listed on the form. A third-floor walk-up in a decaying neighborhood that smelled of neglect and boiled cabbage. They knocked on the door of apartment 3B. The man who answered was gaunt, his hair prematurely gray at the temples, his eyes holding a vacant, fearful quality. He confirmed he was Thomas Brennan. The detectives asked to come in. The apartment was a single room, sparsely furnished with a stained mattress on the floor, a single wooden chair, and a small hot plate. There was no refrigerator. Empty cans of soup were stacked neatly in a corner. A woman, just as thin and pale, sat on the mattress, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring at a crack in the wall. She did not look up when they entered. The lead detective, a veteran named Carl Riggs, spoke softly. "David? David Lawson." The man flinched as if struck. The woman on the mattress finally turned her head, her eyes wide with animal fear. There was a long, silent moment where the only sound was the drip of a leaky faucet in the hall. Then, the man's shoulders slumped, and the fight seemed to drain out of him completely. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "I am David." The woman on the bed began to cry, silent tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks. She was Emily. They were taken to Johns Hopkins Hospital, not to a police station. They were too frail, too broken. Medical examinations painted a grim picture of their 6-year ordeal. Both were suffering from acute malnutrition, their bodies starved of essential nutrients for a prolonged period. They had old, healed fractures, a rib for David, a wrist for Emily. They showed signs of prolonged psychological trauma, diagnosed as a severe catatonic state and amnesia. They were like prisoners of war who had finally been liberated from a hidden camp. The first people to see them, after the doctors, were David's parents, Arthur and Margaret Lawson. The reunion, captured by a single news photographer who managed to get close, was a heartbreaking tableau of joy and profound sorrow. Arthur, his own face aged by a decade of grief, wrapped his arms around his son, who felt like a skeleton in his embrace. Margaret Lawson clung to Emily, sobbing, repeating her name over and over, as if trying to convince herself it was real. But the couple's responses were muted, distant. They accepted the comfort, but seemed unable to fully reciprocate. It was as if a part of them was still locked away, far from that hospital room. The questions began almost immediately, first from family, then from softly spoken psychiatrists, and finally from Detective Riggs, who needed some kind of official statement. The story David and Emily told was fragmented, inconsistent, and deeply unsettling. They claimed they had no memory of the first few years after their disappearance. Their first coherent memories were of being on a farm. They could not describe its location, its landscape, or how they got there. They spoke of it only in vague, fearful terms. "It was just the farm," David would say, his eyes losing focus. "There were fields, and a big, dark barn." They said they were kept there by a group of people. They were not locked in a room. They insisted, but they were never allowed to leave the property. They were forced to work, performing manual labor in the field from dawn until dusk. They were given meager rations, just enough to keep them alive and working. They spoke of the people in charge only as they, never providing descriptions, names, or numbers. When asked why they didn't run away, Emily would just shake her head, a terrified look in her eyes. "They said they would find us. They said they would always find us." It was the logic of captives, a fear so deeply ingrained it had become a part of their DNA. The Baltimore PD, along with the FBI, which had reopened the case, launched a massive manhunt for this mysterious farm. They questioned the couple for hours, days, trying to pry loose a single concrete detail, a license plate, a road sign, a snippet of conversation, the type of crop they were forced to harvest. But David and Emily could provide nothing. Their minds, the psychiatrists theorized, had likely blocked out the trauma as a survival mechanism. The story was maddening. It was a ghost story told by the victims themselves. Law enforcement followed every lead, checking farms across Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. They found nothing. There were no reports of a couple matching their description being seen anywhere. It was as if for 6 years, they had truly ceased to exist, only to be dropped back into reality in a Baltimore slum, their minds and bodies shattered by an experience they could not or would not describe. The happy ending the world had hoped for was curdling into something far more dark and complex. The initial wave of public sympathy for David and Emily Lawson began to recede, leaving behind a tangled shoreline of doubt and suspicion. Their story, the vague and shifting narrative of the mysterious farm, simply did not hold up under the harsh, logical light of investigation. The FBI brought in to handle what was now a potential major kidnapping and enslavement case, hit wall after wall. There was no evidence of a farm. No neighbors had reported seeing them. No one had come forward with information about a couple being held against their will for 6 years. The agricultural departments of 5 states had no record of any large-scale farming operation that had suddenly ceased using manual labor in the spring of 1981. The investigation was chasing a ghost. The medical evidence, once seen as proof of their ordeal, started to be viewed through a different lens. The doctors at Hopkins confirmed the malnutrition and the old, healed injuries. But a consulting psychiatrist, a coolly analytical man named Dr. Ian Walsh, noted something peculiar in his private reports, which later found their way to the FBI. The couple's psychological presentation was inconsistent. Their catatonia and amnesia seemed to flare up precisely when difficult questions were asked about the timeline of their captivity or the identities of their captors. They could discuss the crushing boredom of the farm, the taste of the thin soup they were fed, the ache in their muscles from a day of hard labor, but they could not remember a single face, a single name, or a single word of command spoken to them. It was a blanket of forgetting that was too perfect, too convenient. Detective Carl Riggs, who had been the first to officially identify them, found himself increasingly troubled. He spent long hours in the hospital, sometimes just sitting with them, hoping to gain their trust. He noticed small things. David would sometimes use a word or make a casual reference that seemed out of place for someone who had been isolated from society since 1975. He once corrected a nurse on the brand name of a medication, displaying a knowledge that seemed unlikely for a captive farm laborer. Emily, in a moment of distress, had cried out, and the phrase she used was a piece of slang that had become popular in 1978. When Riggs gently mentioned it later, she had stared blankly, claiming no memory of it, retreating back into her shell of confusion. The families, once united in joy, began to fracture under the strain. Arthur Lawson refused to entertain any notion that his son was lying. He saw the physical evidence, the scars, the weight loss, and that was enough for him. "Look at them," he would snap at reporters who dared to ask questions. "Does it look like they were on a 6-year vacation?" But Emily's parents, the Millers, were quietly, painfully beginning to doubt. Their daughter seemed different in ways that went beyond trauma. There was a secretiveness, evasiveness that felt new. During a private moment, her mother, Rose, had asked her about her wedding ring, why she had left it behind in the villa. Emily's response had been a rambling, nonsensical story about being told that metal attracted lightning, and it was dangerous to wear it on the farm. It was an answer that satisfied nothing. The press, smelling blood in the water, shifted its tone. The headline, "Miracle Honeymooners Found," was replaced with "The Honeymooners Mystery. What are they hiding?" Talk shows debated the case. Body language experts analyzed their few television interviews, pointing out a lack of effect when they discussed their alleged suffering. A private investigator, hired by a skeptical newspaper, dug into their pasts and found nothing but 2 normal, well-liked kids from good families. There was no debt, no secret affairs, no reason to run. But the absence of a motive to disappear only made the absence of evidence for their story more glaring. The break in the stalemate came from an unexpected source, an evidence locker in St. Thomas. With the case explosively reopened, every scrap of the original 1975 investigation was re-examined. A junior FBI agent, tasked with the tedious job of re-inventorying the items from the Lawsons' villa, noticed something that had been overlooked for 6 years. Among David's personal effects was a novel, a popular spy thriller. Tucked in the middle of the book, used as a makeshift bookmark, was a folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from a bank in Hartford, Connecticut, dated September 10, 1975, just 4 days before they left for their honeymoon. It was for a safety deposit box rental. When questioned, Arthur Lawson confirmed that David did have a safety deposit box, which he had used to store important documents like his car title and his will. The box had been closed out by Arthur years after David was declared legally dead. Its contents, a few mundane papers, retrieved and filed away. He had seen nothing unusual, but the FBI, acting on a hunch, obtained a warrant to have the bank vault manager open the box again and conduct a more thorough search. Behind the drawer's felt-lined panel, something had slipped down into the narrow space between the drawer and the vault wall. Using a long, flexible grabber tool, a bank technician retrieved it. It was a small, spiral-bound notebook. David's notebook. The first few pages contained mundane notes about wedding plans and honeymoon itineraries. But the last few pages contained something else entirely. They were filled with dense, frantic writing, a chaotic list of numbers, abbreviations, and short, cryptic phrases. It looked like code. Among the jumble, a few phrases were written in clear English, underlined multiple times. Talk to him, the offer is real, and most chillingly, he doesn't need to know. Not yet. It will be a surprise. The notebook was flown to Baltimore and shown to David in a tense meeting with FBI agents and Dr. Walsh present. The effect was electric. David's vacant expression vanished, replaced by raw panic. He began to hyperventilate, his hands trembling. He claimed he had no memory of the notebook, no idea what the writing meant. He said it must be old notes from a college class. Nonsense scribbles. But his reaction told a different story. It was the reaction of a man who had just seen a ghost from a life he had tried desperately to bury. The farm's story, which was already crumbling, now seemed to be built on a foundation of sand. The mystery was no longer about where they had been for 6 years. It was about why they had really left and what they had been involved in from the very beginning. The idyllic honeymoon had been a lie. Their disappearance had been planned. The discovery of a notebook was the key that finally began to turn the lock. The chaotic scribbles, the frantic energy of the writing. It was not the work of a happy groom planning his wedding. It was the record of a man caught in something he did not fully understand, something he knew was dangerous. Under immense pressure from the FBI, with a notebook laid out on the table between them, David Lawson's carefully constructed story of the farm began to disintegrate. The amnesia, the psychiatrist concluded, was not a result of trauma suffered during captivity, but a psychological defense against the guilt and fear of what he had done. The truth, when it finally emerged in fragments over weeks of painful interrogation, was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. There was no farm. There were no captors. The entire 6-year ordeal was a story, a desperate fabrication built around a kernel of terrifying truth. David, in a low, monotone voice, began to talk. It started with a man he called Only M. Months before the wedding, through a college friend involved in shady financial deals, David had been introduced to M, who represented a group of investors. They had a proposition. David, with his sharp mind and clean record, could be of use to them. They needed someone to move money, to act as a courier for sensitive financial documents between the Caribbean and the United States. The pay was astronomical, enough to set him and Emily up for life. It was presented as a victimless crime, a way to beat the system. David, ambitious and perhaps a little arrogant, was tempted. He saw a shortcut to the life he wanted to provide for his new wife. He took the offer. He noted the details in his code, in the notebook he thought was hidden forever. He doesn't need to know. Not yet. It will be a surprise. The honeymoon in St. Thomas was the cover for his first job. He was to receive a packet of documents from a contact on the island and bring them back to M in the States. But something went terribly wrong. On the afternoon of September 17, 1975, David claimed he went to a prearranged meeting place alone, telling Emily he was going to rent snorkeling gear. The contact never showed. Instead, 2 other men found him. They were angry, accusatory. They claimed David had double-crossed them, that he was working for a rival group. They mentioned sums of money, names he didn't recognize. It was a case of mistaken identity, a dangerous game he had naively stepped into. One of the men showed a gun. David, in a blind panic, was convinced they were going to kill him. He told them everything about Emily, about where they were staying. The men's attitude changed. They told him he had one chance to live. He and his wife had to disappear completely. If they ever contacted their families, if they ever used their real names again, everyone they loved would be in danger. The men knew their parents' names, their addresses. The threat was chillingly specific. Terrified and believing every word, David went back to the villa. He told Emily a version of the truth, that he was in trouble, that they were in immediate mortal danger, that they had to leave everything and run right now. He showed her the gun he had taken from one of the men during the struggle, a fact he had omitted until that moment. The fear in his eyes was real. The threat felt real. In that moment of sheer panic, she believed him. They took nothing. They left the rental Jeep at the remote beach to make it look like an accident, and they walked away from their lives. They were picked up by a boat at a prearranged point, a fishing vessel that took them to Puerto Rico. From there, using fake IDs provided by their mysterious handlers, they melted into the vast, anonymous underbelly of America. For 6 years, they lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror. They moved from one poor neighborhood to another, taking cash-in-hand jobs as dishwashers and cleaners, always afraid to put down roots. The initial contact, the money, the support they were promised, never materialized. They were on their own, abandoned by the very people who had forced them into hiding. The paranoia became a prison more confining than any farm. They were afraid to watch the news, afraid to make friends, afraid of their own shadows. The story of the farm, they later confessed to a psychiatrist, was a narrative they began to construct for themselves, a way to make sense of the senseless prison their lives had become. It was easier to believe they were captives of a visible enemy than to admit they were prisoners of their own fear and a mistake made in a moment of panic. The malnutrition and injuries were from a life of poverty and the stress of their situation, not from forced labor. The FBI, armed with this new information, launched a full reinvestigation into the organized crime networks of the mid-1970s. They identified M as a mid-level player named Frank Moretti, who had been found murdered in a New Jersey warehouse in 1978. The case was a dead end. The two men who threatened David, they likely worked for Moretti or his rivals, and were probably also long dead, casualties of the violent criminal wars of that era. There was no one left to prosecute. The great mystery dissolved into a sad, brutal story of a naive young man who made a disastrous choice and spent 6 years paying for it, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. David and Emily Lawson, once the center of a national sensation, retreated from public view forever. They settled under new names in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, their past a closed book. The world moved on, but the questions never fully disappeared. The official file may be closed, but the story endures as a chilling reminder of how quickly paradise can vanish, not because of monsters or magic, but because of a single human mistake and the terrifying chain of events it can unleash. The truth was not a grand conspiracy, but a simple, devastating tragedy. They were not victims of a shadowy organization, but of a fear so powerful it built its own walls and held them captive for 6 long years. The official closure of the case by the FBI brought no sense of victory, only a hollow, unsatisfying silence. The truth was out, but it was a truth that felt incomplete, a puzzle with several pieces still missing, lost under the furniture of time. For the families, the aftermath was a new kind of agony. The Millers, Emily's parents, were consumed by a quiet, burning resentment. They felt David had stolen their daughter twice, first through his foolishness and lies, and then by dragging her into a 6-year nightmare built on a foundation of panic and poor judgment. The image of their vibrant, careful daughter living in squalor, jumping at every shadow, all because of a secret her husband kept, was a pain they could not forgive. Their relationship with the Lawsons, once so close, became a tense, formal affair of brief, awkward phone calls on birthdays and holidays. Arthur Lawson, though heartbroken by his son's actions, remained his staunchest defender. He saw not a criminal, but a terrified boy who made a catastrophic error in judgment and then spent every waking moment trying to protect the woman he loved from the consequences. He hired a team of expensive lawyers not to fight charges. There were none, but to manage the media frenzy and secure his son's fragile new identity. He set up a trust fund for them, a carefully managed account that would provide a modest, anonymous living far from the spotlight. The money was both a lifeline and an admission of guilt, a father's attempt to finally fix the unfixable. David and Emily, now known as Thomas and Clara Brennan, settled into a small, weather-beaten cottage on the remote Oregon coast. The constant drizzle and the thunder of the Pacific Ocean suited their mood. The world forgot about them, but they could not forget the world. The paranoia did not vanish with the truth. It had become a part of them, a deep-seated habit of the mind. They rarely went into town. They shopped at odd hours. Thomas would still sometimes jerk his head at the sound of a car engine that sounded unfamiliar, his hand instinctively reaching for a gun that was no longer there. Clara would spend hours staring out at the gray, endless sea, her expression unreadable. The 6 years had stolen their youth and their trust, not just in others, but in each other. Their marriage, the very thing that had started the chain of events, became a quiet, strained partnership. The shared trauma was a wall between them, not a bridge. They rarely spoke of the past. When they did, it was in coded, careful phrases. The bad time, they called it. The love that had once been so bright and public was now a dim, private ember, carefully guarded. They were two survivors in a lifeboat, bound together by the storm they had endured, but unable to truly talk about the waves that had nearly drowned them. Years turned into a decade. The story of the vanished honeymooners became a footnote in true crime books, a classic example of a hoax that wasn't a hoax, a mystery that was solved but would never feel solved. Then, in 1995, a letter arrived at the FBI field office in Baltimore. It was from a retired detective named Carl Riggs. He had never been able to let the case go. In his retirement, he had been going over his old notes, the tiny inconsistencies that had never been explained. He focused on one element that had always bothered him, the initial threat. David had always claimed the two men who accosted him knew everything. Their names, their families' addresses. But how? David insisted he'd never given that information to M. So how did these low-level enforcers have such specific, personal details so instantly? Riggs had a theory. He believed David's story of the botched meeting and the threat was true, but he suspected David had left out a crucial, shameful detail. Riggs theorized that David, in his panic, didn't just tell the men about Emily. He offered them a deal. He gave them the personal information, his parents' address, Emily's parents' address, as collateral, as proof that he would comply, that he understood the stakes. He handed over the keys to his entire life to save his own. It was an act of ultimate betrayal, one so painful that even years later, his mind could not admit to it. This, Riggs argued, was the source of the deep, unspoken rift between David and Emily. She may have forgiven him for getting them into trouble, but could she ever truly forgive him for using the safety of her own parents as a bargaining chip with criminals? This was the real secret, the true ghost haunting their small cottage on the Oregon coast. It was a theory that could never be proven, but it fit the facts better than any other. The final, lingering mystery of the Lawson case is not where they were, but who they became. They lived out their days in quiet obscurity, their past a locked box within a locked room. Thomas Brennan died of a heart attack in 2007. Clara Brennan passed away just 2 years later. The local paper carried a small obituary for a quiet, reclusive couple who kept to themselves, noting only that they had no surviving children. There is no mention of St. Thomas, of honeymoons, of 6 lost years, or of a name that was once famous, Emily Lawson. The truth had set them free from the public eye, but it never freed them from themselves. Their story remains a deeply unsettling lesson in how quickly a life can unravel, not from a single grand disaster, but from a series of small, secret choices that build a prison from the inside out. The monsters weren't waiting for them on a farm or in the Caribbean shadows. The real monster was fear itself, and it shared their small, rented cottage on the coast for the rest of their days.